Okay, to conclude the lecture today on global inequalities and consumerism, I'm going to touch upon what some of these Bauman-esque ideas mean in terms of class, in terms of violence, in terms of happiness. So, Bauman's notion of the tourist and vagabond is kind of a metaphorical, almost literary device to think about these things. But there's a whole array of sociologists around the world that are working on research about those very relationships, and Leslie Sclare's work on the transnational capitalist class is a particularly good example of the way that privilege itself is something that needs to be studied more and more. Much analysis of class tends to focus on the disadvantaged and the marginalised, and there's reasons for that, right? Because sociologists that are interested in that tend to want to improve those relations, do something about inequality, and hopefully help make people more happy. But there's been less attention paid to those that are, particularly privileged, and that's kind of changing a bit over the past 10 or 15 years. So Sclare kind of sketches out what he calls this transnational capitalist class, divided into four fractions: owners, controllers of multinational corporations, globalising bureaucrats and politicians, globalising professionals, and consumerist elites. And for him, these groups of people are the ones who benefit the most from globalisation and the actual drivers of it. In another prominent work in the 90s called The Global Trap, there's a really good example of kind of that tourist and vagabond being writ large, in terms of there was a group of very privileged politicians and business and economic leaders met in 1995 at a big conference, and they had serious discussions about how this inequality was actually what was happening in terms of this inequality, and they kind of predicted essentially that after the way things are going, only 20% of the population would be needed to keep the production going, leaving about 80% on the periphery. And if that was to happen, what could these leaders do to ensure there wasn't some kind of huge upheaval or revolution? Because they were concerned that if there wasn't something done about it, that may actually happen. So a really prominent US security advisor at the time suggested the idea of tiddytainment. This is a serious conversation happening at a global economic conference, where what governments might have to do is just provide enough entertainment, kind of like bread and circuses here, to kind of keep the other 80% both entertained and nourished. So the tiddytainment there isn't referring to porn, it's referring to that notion of bread and circuses, just keep them nourished enough and then entertain enough. Again, this was a serious conversations at a global economic conference about what governments should do in the future about the growing nature of inequality. So again, here you can see not a lot of kind of actual ethics and morals will be in thinking about too much of what it means to be an actual human being when you're pushed out to the periphery. Much more about how we can shore up our own wealth and keep it going. And this, in relation to the periphery as well, Julia Iriaki has written some really amazing work about the spectatorship of suffering, and more recently the notion of the ironic spectator. A term like compassion fatigue that you're probably quite familiar with, she's written about that extensively, and she essentially does an argument that talks about like one of the reasons why many people in that kind of 20%, the tourists, the West, the North or whatever, might be really upset about what's going on, might know a lot about it, might be really aware, but tend not to do a lot about it. So if you're interested in the moral and ethics of what it means to be a Westerner, to be aware about this stuff, to be witnessing it, but then we don't tend to do much about it, Julia Iraki's work in particular is central to kind of thinking about that compassion fatigue and that inaction and ambivalence. Another way of thinking about this is Slavoj Zizek's work on what he calls systemic violence. So Zizek essentially argues that there's a kind of violence that's perpetuated as part of the global neoliberal kind of capitalist system, where it's just ever present in our day-to-day lives, but it's not necessarily this notion of real physical violence or even that kind of Borgesian symbolic violence. This is a more kind of what he calls objective violence. So there's various politics of fear, that's symbolic language, symbolic violence of inherited language, the systemic pressures of our economy, Even, the very notion of tolerance can be seen as a kind of supporter of symbolic violence, in the sense that, tolerance implies that you don't necessarily like or appreciate something, you've just got to put up with it. But Zizek goes further than that and distinguishes between those kind of real, physical and emotional violences and what he calls objective violence, which is the hidden, symbolic and systemic violence of culture, politics and economics. Zizek basically argues that there's a kind of understanding of violence that's in the system that he kind of, I suppose, points out that's sort of like dark matter of physics. Difficult to understand, but it's there. It's something that we all know is there. It's kind of normal, but it's invisible, and it sustains the way that these kind of global relations work. It may be invisible, but it has to be taken into account if one is to make sense of what otherwise seem to be irrational explosions of subjective violence every now and then. So some examples of that, it's kind of hard to think about what that means, but you see something like the reaction of Foxconn's factories in China when, these are the factories that make iPhones. And when there's a reported, increase in kind of suicide rates, rather than actually do something about the working conditions, they just put up these kind of nets here to try and stop people jumping out the buildings, or if not stop them, catch them. So not fix the conditions, but put a net up to catch people when they jump off. Another example is the mining of coltan. Again, there's this kind of invisible violence that many of us in the West don't really see. There's a really great series of books around consumer resources by Polity Press. There's the book on coltan, on timber, on fish, water, oil and food. And if you're interested in the way that the kind of this material needs of consumer culture on a global level play out in terms of global inequalities, they're really good things to have a look at. So I'm not going to talk about that one too much. You can have a read of that quote there. Coltan is essentially the key natural resource needed to make things like capacitors that are so central to things like mobile phones and computers and things like that. So, in terms of these notions of global inequality and the relationality of it, what does it mean for the people in the West, in the global North, that tend to be the beneficiaries of these global inequalities? Well, many people argue that it's not actually doing much for our happiness. The consumer culture, again, provides us with desire, not happiness, and this leads to anxiety, insecurity, precarity, and other, would argue, stress and mental health issues. So Michael Pusey in particular did a really interesting study in the late 90s, early 2000s on what he called Middle Australia, and you're probably familiar with that term when it was co-opted into politics throughout the rest of that decade, and found that many people in Australia, despite being really materially comfortable, were not particularly happy. Clive Hamilton's work and others, particularly around the Australia Institute, talk about this through the notions of growth fetish and affluenza. That here rampant consumerism is the actual cause of people's problems, not the solution. That we're kind of spending ourselves sick. Now, in relation to that, you can click on that link there that talks about this from the American perspective, what Juliet Shaw calls the overspent American. This notion we're spending ourselves sick, we're wasteful, as we were talking about last week, we're overworked, stressed, in debt, increasingly subscribed to all kinds of medication. Again, this relates to that notion that consumer culture produces desire and not satisfaction, and some of the work for the Australian Institute a few years ago now found some really interesting findings here, both statistically and qualitatively. They found that 47% of the people in the highest income group in Australia say they can't afford to buy everything they need. Only 5% of millionaires regard themselves as prosperous. 50% of millionaires only say that they're reasonably comfortable. So I'll leave those stats again for you to have a look at. But again, it shows that kind of this material comfort within consumer culture, even for people that kind of can afford to buy lots of stuff, doesn't seem to be leading to notions of satisfaction and happiness. And this relates to the basic arguments at the spirit level. Again, this is a TED talk there that I do show in the first year lecture. But this idea that countries with inequalities within them, and particularly large inequalities, tend to be the ones that are least healthy, least satisfied, least happy. And Australia tends to be on one of the higher levels of inequalities when it comes to these economic markers.